Welcome to my 11th Making Browser Games tutorial, and today's video is going to be a pretty important topic. I wanted to cover functions and how to code them in JavaScript. And so first, what I'll do is I want to get rid of all this code here for our rock, paper, scissors game. I don't want to delete it, but I want to make it ineffective. So like I said before, a good way to make code ineffective is just to comment it out. So I'm going to type /star, starting with the very first line of code, and then in the very last line of code, I'm going to type //. So all that should be left is the closing script tag and the opening script tag. So what I did is I just created a multi-line comment, which turned all of this code into a comment, which means that this program will no longer run. And that's good because I wanted to take a sidestep and look at a different topic before we go back to rock, paper, scissors. And if I haven't already explained multi-line comments, they're just a different kind of comment. Let's say I had some really long note to myself that I was trying to leave. If I wanted to comment out this whole note the normal way, I'd have to type // for every single line. And like, as you could see just a second ago, if I wanted to comment out all of my code, that would be quite a lot of work. So instead, you can just bypass that /*/ like that. And this is all just one comment. So I wanted to talk about functions. And functions in JavaScript are just commands. But before I go into them, you've already used several functions. So prompt is a function, confirm is a function, alert is a function, console.log is a function, the math functions we did, math.random, math.floor, all of these are functions that you have used before. A function is just a command. It will execute a certain amount of code. But what I wanted to talk about was how to make your own functions, because all these functions are set in stone. They are a part of JavaScript. We can never change what console.log does, but we can make our own functions. Creating your own function is kind of like a variable. So you start with the word function, and then you give it a name. So I'm going to use a math example today. So I'm going to make a function that will add two numbers. So I'm going to call it add. And I say it's like a variable because with variables you start with var and then you give a name. Functions start the same way. Function, add. But like you saw in those other examples, math.floor, console.log, functions have parentheses. So what I'm going to do is add two parentheses after the word add. And just like an if statement, I'm going to add two curly brackets and put some space in between them. And just like the if statements, you don't add semicolons at the end of these curly brackets here. It wouldn't be a mistake, it wouldn't break your code, but it would be unnecessary. So this is your starting function. This is an empty function, does nothing. What goes in between these two curly brackets is the contents of this function. So I can simply console.log 1 plus 2 like that. And now something interesting is going to happen here because if I were to actually run this, you might expect to get a 3 to the console, but in fact we get nothing on the console. This code did not execute because this function here, we simply declared the function. This is our function declaration. We are telling JavaScript that there is a function here called add. This is what it does, but don't do it yet. To actually execute this function, we need to type the name of the function followed by two parentheses and a semicolon. This is executing the function. This is just declaring it. And the coding word for that is calling a function. So what I'm doing here on line 30 is I'm calling the add function, which is just executing this line of code here. And now if I refresh the page, I get a 3 here. And now, and you can add more statements to the function. You can create variables inside the function. You can do anything like you would normal inside the function. But the code does not execute until you call the function here. Now this is a pretty useless function by itself because no matter how many times I call the add function here, I'm always going to get the exact same result. I'm just going to get a bunch of 3s. Our add function should be more customizable. It should be able to add any two numbers that I want. But what am I going to do? Create another add function, call it add2, and then just change the numbers here. What we're going to do instead is we're going to create parameters for this function. Parameters are just a way of getting outside information inside of a function. So in add, I'm going to add two parameters. Parameters are just variables. num1, comma, num2. And instead of adding 1 and 2, I'm going to add num1 and num2. This won't do anything yet because we don't know what these variables, these parameters, are supposed to be. But we can set them if we modify our function call here. Now when I call the function, I asked for two parameters, two variables. I must give two values. So instead of adding 1 and 2, I'm going to add 3, comma, and then 3 inside of the parentheses. And notice you can kind of see where these line up. This first value, this first 3 corresponds to num1. The second 3 corresponds to num2. And what this is going to give us is it's going to give us a 6 on the console, which it does here. And this is a much more useful function because now what you can do is you can call add multiple different times, but you can change the values every time. So we'll do something like that, just some random values, and you get a little bit more dynamic of a result using this function. Using parameters. Parameters are just ways of getting outside information inside of a function. We want to know which two numbers to add. Well, you add those here. And by the way, a little bit of coding terminology. These are called parameters. They are the actual variables that appear in the function, but these are called arguments, the value that you give the parameters. These are arguments, these are parameters. When I was learning the code, I called them all parameters, and it really does not matter, but if I call these arguments instead of parameters, that's why. Now we have a much better add function, but it's not entirely useful because all it does is it outputs to the console here. Doesn't do anything else special. What we should be able to do is save this sum and put it in a variable. And now that might sound kind of weird. You cannot save this sum. Something we couldn't do is say var sum is equal to add. That would be kind of cool. Let me put 1 and 4. That would be kind of cool to treat the function as a variable, but right now this would not actually work. But there is a way to basically turn this function into a variable. I can modify it a little bit. What we're going to do is we're going to make this function act like a variable that holds a value by returning a value. I'm going to type the word return, and then I'm going to just add that sum, num1 plus num2. Followed by a semicolon. And I'm going to comment this code out for now. So now the function add does not log anything. Instead, it just returns the value of the sum of these two numbers, which means this whole add function is basically equal to 5 now. If you don't believe me, you can just type it here, console.log sum. So if this works, sum should be a variable that's equal to 5. And it is right here, 5. When you return a value from a function, you're basically setting that function equal to that return value here. So this add is equal to 5. This add would be equal to 9, and so on. Now I'm going to make a slight change to the function. I'm going to get rid of these comments here. And now you might expect to see a 5 and a 5, two 5s in the console, which would kind of make sense. We're logging num1 plus num2, which is 5, and then we're logging the sum here. But when I run this, notice that there's only one 5, and according to the whatever this is here, I actually have no clue what to call that. It says that this 5 came from line 34. Line 34 is this console.log. So this console.log on line 29 never even happened. We only got one 5. So how come this one didn't work? Well, the reason it didn't work is because when you return a value from a function, you're not just returning that value, to the main program here. You're basically exiting the function. Think of it like this. JavaScript runs like this. It starts from top to bottom. It looks over your function declaration and it sees it, doesn't run it. You got to call it first. Then 32 is the first line of code that it will run. It's going to create a variable and it's going to set that variable equal to add. Well, now JavaScript's got to jump back up here, execute this code, but once it gets to return, it's going to return back to the main code here. This code gets skipped. Whenever you return, you exit the function. So it doesn't matter how many of these I would put after, none of them would ever run. All this gets skipped. And so that's why we only saw 1.5 to the console. Here's another quick note about functions before we finish this video. You can return any value or no value from a function. So I could return strings, hello, and so what I'm going to do is, now when I run this, I get hello, which does not make sense for an add function with 2 parameters to return hello, but you can do that. You can return true, you can return false, you can return any number, and then you can just return by itself. Now notice this is going to be an error. When I run this, I get undefined. So when I try to set my variable to a function that returns nothing, it's undefined. And it would be the same thing if I didn't have a return. If I ran this, undefined. So what you cannot do is set a variable to a function that returns nothing. But you can set the variable to a function that returns a value. And then one more thing, you cannot return 2 values. I cannot return 5 and 90 for the simple reason that once this code executes, this gets skipped. So you cannot return multiple values like that. And so with this, if you want, I'm going to just create 3 other functions: divide, multiply, subtract, and you can pause the video and see if you can figure those out on your own. Alright, so next I'm going to add subtract, function subtract num1, num2, and we're just going to return num1 minus num2, function multiply num1, num2 for our parameters, and then return num1 times num2, and then divide. I'm going to do something a little bit fancier. I'm going to also make this function stop you if you try to divide by 0, which actually is a kind of good thing about functions. You can add extra functionality to just a simple math operation. So let's say this is going to be my numerator, this will be my denominator. So I can just say if the num2, the denominator, is 0, then what I'm going to do is console.log you cannot divide by 0, yell at the user, make them feel terrible about themselves, and then return, I'm just going to return a random number of negative 999. But if the denominator is valid, we're just going to return num1 divided by num2. And those are all my math functions. I'm going to just create a variable a, and I'm just going to test them all out here. I'm going to add 1 and 4. We get 5. Going to subtract 1 and 4, negative 3. I don't really care about multiply, but let me show you divide. So this should give me 0.25, but let's try to divide by 0 here. And what we're going to get is this. You cannot divide by 0, negative 999. So we just safely set the value to be negative 999 if we tried to divide by 0. And that's it. That's functions for you. Functions are just ways of, well, basically, I didn't even explain this earlier, but just taking all this code for divide, for example, and just shortening it to one line. So let's say I wanted to divide many different times. I wanted to divide those numbers and then I wanted to divide those numbers and divide those numbers. But let's say every single time I wanted to check and make sure I wasn't dividing by 0. Well, I'd have to add this if statement every single time, but by using a function, I'm basically reusing this code. And this safety check, making sure the denominator is not 0, I get to use that over and over again. So functions are ways you can reuse code so that I don't have to add this if statement 3 times. There are good ways of naming code, and what we're going to do is we're going to use functions in the next video to improve our rock, paper, scissors to where we can clearly see this step is getting the player move, this step is getting the computer move, and this step is finding the winner. Functions are good ways of naming the task that your code does. And that's it for my functions video. Thank you for watching.